What's up, it's Waifu Belector, and people, we are coming up on the end of 2023. We are very nearly at the finish line, and this year has had more notable games than you could shake a damn stick at. To the point that anyone trying to keep up with what has pretty much been a non-stop release schedule has likely had a rough time, or at least a few stumbles trying to stay on top of things, myself included. That's right, even though I hop on here and make these stupid little videos where I talk about video games, there were a few of them that I haven't really mentioned. So I'm making this video to rectify that. I'm gonna talk about the games that I played this year, but for whatever reason didn't make a video about. And as I talk about each game, I'll try to explain why I didn't talk about them earlier. And spoiler alert, none of those reasons will be because the game was bad. I mean, it can't be. I talked about the Golem game earlier this year. So yeah, this is what we're doing. Hopefully you find these takes interesting or insightful, or maybe even find something to play. I'll have chapters in the video and timestamps in the description so you can skip to a specific game if you'd like, but that's all for the introduction. Okay, let's do it. To start things off, we have Mageseeker. So, a little background because I know everybody may not be aware. Riot Games of League of Legends fame has a publishing wing called Riot Forge. Riot Forge basically shops around the League of Legends IP to indie developers who get to make a canonical story focused on a champion or champions of their choosing. 3 of these Riot Forge published games were released in 2023. I did play them all, but didn't talk about any of them simply because I didn't feel like they command the notoriety that would make it necessary. And with so many games out this year, I took my rest where I could get it, you know? Anyway, Mageseeker is one of those Riot Forge games, developed by the indie studio Digital Sun. And Mageseeker is a good game. In terms of genre, what you're looking at is a kinda arena-based action game. It's something that moves and feels closer to games like Hades, but is structured more like Devil May Cry from level to level. So because it has the Hades melee-based 2D arena feel, you'll have some idea of what to expect. And for the most part, it's a pretty standard affair. Light attack, heavy attack, dash, and your chains that can pull you toward enemies or vice versa. You can also equip up to 4 spells, which naturally cost mana, but you get mana back by doing melee attacks. And there are a decent variety of spells. Where this all becomes a better, more energized gameplay loop is with your player character's gimmick. You play as Silas, whose biggest thing is that he can absorb magic. So while you can employ up to 4 spells, enemies also wield magic of their own. Magic that you can take and use against them or their comrades. This ability is where the game butters its bread. By having methodically thought out arenas of enemies whom you're prioritizing and using to your own advantage in the best way you can see fit during what can be some frantic fights. You can only have 1 stolen spell at a time, and you only get 1 use of it. And of course, certain enemies are weak to certain elemental magic, and certain enemies are more threatening than others. So the question becomes, do I use the Ice Guy spell to kill the Fire Guy, or absorb the Fire Guy spell to kill the Ice Guy? Well, maybe I save the Ice Guy for last because his spell is an AoE attack that can help me against hordes, or has a slow effect against a large light magic enemy. You see, the point is, arenas often have a fun little layout that adds a touch of a combat puzzle to the standard reactionary action. It's pretty cool and it's pretty fun. Now, Mageseeker does also have a story, of course, the basic premise being that Silas is born a mage in Demacia, a city and society that is extremely hostile towards mages. But they hypocritically use mages to hunt other mages, who are then either forced to join the Mageseeker ranks, imprisoned, or worse. After being imprisoned himself for 15 years, Silas manages to escape and begins plotting his revenge, which then begins to turn into a revolution. So that's pretty much the setup, and as you continue to play the game and go through the entire story, it's fine. Closer to being bad than it is to being great, but it's fine. The game to begin with isn't doing anything remarkable in any sense, but it does what it's setting out to do competently enough for a good game. In my opinion, what hurts this game the most is a lack of voice acting as well as the pixel art style. If your game is pixel art, it's almost automatically niche. But even as far as pixel art goes, this is far from being the most attractive pixel game. And as I said, that along with the fact that you're sitting there reading your way through dialogue dialogue like it's 1998 or some shit, saps away what could have been the boost to make this game better than just good. To me, it's a nice little 7 out of 10. A good game with nothing remarkable happening. And that's a phrase that I think would apply to the other 2 Riot Forge games that came out this year as well. But we'll get to those. For now, I'll move on to something a lot more popular. Baldur's Gate 3. Some of you may be happy to hear that I did actually play Baldur's Gate 3, so why didn't I talk about it? Well, it wasn't my original intention to purchase or play this game at all. You know, it was part 3 of a game with C-list popularity at best, and my personal interest was exactly 0. Also, there were just a lot of games out that I was already playing, and for a console player like myself, Baldur's Gate 3 would eventually happen at the same time as Starfield. Anyway, although I had every intention to ignore this irrelevant game, who could have guessed that they'd catapult themselves into the public gaming zeitgeist so randomly? And while Baldur's Gate as a franchise is still far from the most popular thing, Baldur's Gate 3 was made impossible to ignore in 2023. When people sing a game's praises this hard, I pretty much have to see what it is for myself. So as I was playing Starfield, Baldur's Gate 3 was sitting there fully downloaded on my PlayStation waiting its turn. And as soon as Starfield was done, I got to it. So what did I think? Well, I won't really hold you in suspense of the verdict. It's just a really great game, but I'll actually get into it. So this game is an RPG-ass RPG. And there's always a lot of talk about what makes an RPG, but to me, it's never been very complicated. The main characteristic of the RPG genre is choice. Whether that choice lie in combat or dialogue or whatever, abundance of and freedom of choice is what makes an RPG to me. And so I tell you again, this is an RPG-ass RPG. We can both play the game and our parties were completely different, and I do mean completely. The choices you make can result in extremely different outcomes for a multitude of scenarios. And I'm speaking generally because if I speak too specifically, we'll be here for hours on end. It can be argued that if you like choice and role-playing in a video game, there may not be a better option than Baldur's Gate 3. They even sidestep what is often a problem of turn-based combat, which is that even though you literally choose what the character does in turn-based combat, your choices are extremely limited and thus combat is extremely restrictive and can even feel on rails. Baldur's Gate 3 shimmies past all of that by just giving any given character a shit ton of options at all times. Now hold on. Because everyone up to this point, including me from just a second ago, has helped to convince you that this game is virtually perfect. And it really isn't. It has some problems that to me are rather obvious and pretty definitively keep it from being perfect. For instance, I know I just praised the combat and the choice it has, but the battles in this game are quite drawn out and most of them are pretty challenging. This would be an okay combination assuming that combat encounters are relatively sparse, and that is the case near the beginning of the game, or at least it can be, but about a third of the way through, there becomes a lot of fucking combat. So it begins to feel like this never-ending slow slog of fighting for your fucking life for entirely too long at times. I mean, a lot of the game isn't combat, most of it even, but there's too much combat for the way that this game's combat is structured, you know? Anyway, another sticking point of mine is that the game is just too long. It took me 80 hours to beat and I didn't 100% it, nor was I trying. The game is just outrageously, almost laughably fucking long. To me, and I think most people would agree with this, a 30-hour game is a long game. But I think even if you beat Baldur's Gate 3 exceptionally quicker than normal, you'd still be done with it in about 50 hours, 20 hours longer than an already long game. The game has too long of a mandatory playtime, that is the truth. Now I'd say that those two things, the length of the game and the mishandling of combat, up against what Baldur's Gate offers, only removes about half a point for me. This game's biggest problem to me is its Act 2. The game has 3 acts, and buddy, let me tell you, Act 2 was the developers Larian Studios tripping all over themselves. As soon as you enter Act 2, there is a weird off-putting difficulty spike that might frustrate a Dark Souls fan, and you're forced to spend time in the most artistically unattractive zone in the game. Just a pure black, gray, dead, rubble-infested dour area filled with blight status effects that can kill your whole party if you aren't careful about traversal, complete with a series of strange, unfun challenges that may very well be the least well thought out parts of the game. I'm talking about the Gauntlet of Shar or whatever. Act 2 is a mess. The game is still doing right what it fundamentally is there to do. It makes good on its true RPG elements, but all the finer points of game design, level design, art direction, and pacing just go out the fucking window. I could not wait to get out of Act 2. And you know what's crazy? When I did, the game picked itself up, it dusted itself off, and it got back to being as fun as it started. But holy fuck, Act 2 is something else. Removal of a whole point for me. But whatever. The majority of Baldur's Gate 3 is thoroughly, aggressively enjoyable. I don't happen to think it's the 10 out of 10 game that a lot of people do, but I do think it's an objectively really great one. I have it scored at an 8.5 out of 10. This level of role-playing, decision-making, and dialogue choice combined with this level of polish is just very impressive and fun. Fun enough that even tripping and falling into the mud during its second act still couldn't stop the jewel that is Baldur's Gate 3 from shining. But alright, on to the next. And sorta on to the previous, because we're going back to Riot Forge. Let's talk about the second Riot Forge game to release this year, Convergence. Convergence follows the League of Legends champion Echo and is a 2D action platformer developed by Double Stallion. Much like Mageseeker, Convergence is a pretty standard deal, and it does what you expect of its genre. But if you know anything about Echo, you know that he's the boy who shattered time, and Double Stallion has of course worked his signature ability to rewind time into the game's mechanics. And it's this ability on top of what is otherwise a pretty typical action platformer that really turns it into something worth playing. You can hold up to 3 charges of your rewind, and when activated, you hold the rewind button to manually go back in time, and you can hold it for a good long while. Most importantly, as you go back in time, your health and other resources follow suit. So if you get hit, you can rewind and you'll gain the health back. On top of that, the enemy will always attempt the same attack, giving you an insight into what you should do next. It's actually a very cool and well implemented mechanic that mostly carries the game. And it sounds like the game would be way too easy because of the time rewind mechanic, but trust me, it isn't. Double Stallion has done well to take their premier feature into account, and it doesn't mitigate all the challenge. The story of Convergence is also pretty good. It's not amazing, but it's better than Mageseeker. However, because of recent restructuring of League of Legends lore and Arcane rightfully being made canon, and at the forefront of the canon no less, there is the unfortunate side effect that Convergence appears to be very clearly no longer canon, seeing as how this version of Echo's story strongly contradicts the version in Arcane. Yeah, but anyway, Convergence isn't really a game that's gonna blow anybody's mind, even with the cool addition of the ability to rewind time, but it is a good and competent game that, unlike Mageseeker, is fully voice acted, but like Mageseeker, I feel is a 7 out of 10. A bit of a stronger 7 than Mageseeker, but a 7 all the same. Anyway, moving on, but still keeping it indie, let's talk about Sea of Stars. I didn't talk about Sea of Stars earlier than this video because frankly, it didn't seem necessary. The game's popularity did not demand that I played it as soon as possible, and so I got to it when I felt like it. And to be honest, even before I played it, knowing I was gonna play it, I was only really gonna play it because of what I said earlier in regard to Baldur's Gate. When people are singing a game's praises very aggressively and loudly, I almost can't help but have to see what it is for myself. Of course, there are far less people talking about Sea of Stars than Baldur's Gate, but the people who played Sea of Stars swore by it religiously. And so here I am, having played Sea of Stars all the way through, only to discover what was truly the most likely outcome, that the level of praise that this game was getting was and is completely unfounded. Don't get me wrong, Sea of Stars is a good game, but it's just that, and only that. Good. It's not amazing, it's not incredible, it's not great, it's not fantastic, it's good. See, and that's the thing about these kinds of niche and or retro nostalgia baiting games. A lot of the people who care to play the game love that kind of thing so much that before they've ever played it, they've decided it's good. And if it turns out that it actually is good, then to these fans, the game is catapulted into great and beyond. Whether it's true or not, that's their story and they're sticking to it. And 9 times out of 10, the game won't be as good as those people are saying. So let me explain Sea of Stars a bit, and this should be easy. Have you ever played an old school turn-based RPG? It's just one of those, with nothing wildly original or creative happening. From the way combat happens to the restrictiveness of the game to the pretty by-the-books anime story, Sea of Stars is just your everyday turn-based RPG of old. What it does though is try to avoid a lot of the pitfalls of games that came before it, while also cherry-picking the good stuff, and so you end up with an old school RPG that kind of trims the fat off of the formula to a degree. For instance, the game's story does get a little tough to follow near the end, but nothing close to the incomprehensible lunacy of something like Final Fantasy. Sea of Stars also uses the active timing mechanic to make turn-based combat more lively, where if you tap a button just as your character's attack connects, you get a little extra damage or an extra hit, a lot like Paper Mario and the Thousand Year Door. Sorry if Paper Mario weren't the first people to do that, that's just where I first experienced that mechanic. Unfortunately, Sea of Stars doesn't sidestep the restrictiveness of turn-based combat in the way that Baldur's Gate manages to. You don't have a whole lot of viable options at any given moment, and those options are minimized further by a couple of moves being blatantly better than everything else. Like the Moonerang ability that basically lets you do infinite damage as long as you're able to time the deflection correctly, like this. There are very few reasons to not attempt that attack every chance you get. Also, to make sure the game feels properly restrictive, when you level up, you can't just put your points into whatever you want. Instead, the game gives you 4 of the 6 stat choices to choose from, and you just pick one. So if you were planning on just upping a character's HP all the way through or dumping everything into attack, you can't. In fact, I think upping the same stat twice in a row might be impossible. Then there's a mistake that Sea of Stars doesn't get from anybody else and is kinda its own original problem, I think. When battling enemies, at some point, they'll begin charging up for their special attack, but you can stop this attack by hitting them with a certain combination of elemental effects displayed above their head before the move finishes charging. That's not the unique part. The unique part is the problem with it. Often, the combination necessary to stop one of these special attacks is simply not possible with your team composition. Or even if it is, it requires all 3 of your characters to attack, but only 2 of them will get the chance before the enemy is finished. Now, there are combo attacks that make it so that you can get several elemental effects on a single attack, but you have to charge the combo meter by attacking through the battle. And I shit you not, a lot of the time the only way to stop the enemy special in time is with a combo attack, but there's no possible way you can have a combo attack because it'll literally be the first turn, and the enemy is only gonna be charging for 1 turn. If I'm not illustrating this clearly enough, I'll make it simple. There are attacks that the game says you can stop from happening, but you actually can't. And typically, the attacks aren't that devastating, you'll be okay, but why lie to me? That's my question. If you want the enemy to do the attack, just have him do the attack. Don't pretend I can stop him, it's fucking weird. But yeah, through it all, Sea of Stars still manages to be a game worth the play, in no small part thanks to its visual presentation. Listen, I like pixel art. Well, like anything, I like when it's done well. I don't cream my underoos over it because my nostalgia is weak, but I like it fine. And Sea of Stars is a pretty pixel art game and is animated fantastically. Obviously, it's pixel art, so duh, it's cheap, but it doesn't move cheaply. Clearly someone actually gave a fuck about how this game looked and how it would feel. So despite it being an automatically niche visual style, it's excelling in its class. The quality of the pixel art and the fluidity of the animation does a lot in the way of making this game worthwhile. Sea of Stars reminds me a lot of Tunic, if you ever played that, another indie game with nearly zero creativity but did the thing well enough. But that game was doing a Zelda Souls-like, and Sea of Stars is doing a retro RPG. Shout out the way Tunic did their map though, that was actually creative, so clap it up for their one creative idea. But yeah, regardless of the similarities, I still feel that Sea of Stars did their thing just a little bit better than Tunic did. Whatever though, to me, Sea of Stars is yet another nice solid 7 out of 10. So let's move on. And we're going back to where everyone wants to be, Riot Forge. No, this is the last time though, okay? This is the third and final Riot Forge game to release in 2023, Song of NuNu. Song of NuNu is a very chill, very relaxing 3D puzzle platformer. The game's not hard at all. It's a sweet little 8-hour experience that doesn't bother wasting your time, and it has a decent story that kinda gets bumped up to pretty good if you care about League of Legends lore. So I mean, yeah, the game is just this cute, chill romp with endearing protagonists NuNu and Willump going on an adventure, and it achieves a good balance of being easy and relaxing while avoiding being so brain dead and long that it's disengaging. There are also some fun and creative puzzles using NuNu's flute that require you to play notes with certain timing in order to progress. Again, Song of NuNu isn't really about challenging the player, so there aren't any puzzles that are gonna melt your brain, but the puzzles are still pretty fun for the most part. Another thing I can say about Song of NuNu is, of the 3 Riot Forge games to release this year, this one has the best presentation by far. Mageseeker being pixel art is already off-putting to a ton of people, and it's not even particularly great pixel art, but even Convergence has a strange art style that's easy not to want to engage with, whereas Song of NuNu has a more universally acceptable, if not attractive look. You might see what it's all about and how it plays and come to the conclusion that it's not your thing, but it's not something that you just look at and say no. In a lot of ways, I think Song of NuNu plays and feels how Daedalic Studios wanted the Golem game to play. I feel that Song of NuNu, gameplay wise, is what Golem was going for, but it fell so far short. Once again, Song of NuNu is not gonna blow your socks off. You won't have to pick your jaw up off the floor, but they're trying to do something and they do it well. That's right, I'm gonna say it, 7 out of 10. I'm sorry, that's the last one though. Listen, I don't want to be that guy. I don't want to keep saying 7 out of 10, but that's the truth. But it's okay, it's over now. That was the last 7 in the video. I'm sorry. Okay, now with Riot Forge out of the way, with the 7s out of the way, let's talk about Lords of the Fallen. Lords of the Fallen is solid enough, but it's got a lot of problems, and that's even by Souls-like standards, which if you ask me is a genre with some pretty outstanding fundamental problems. It's actually because of those problems that every now and then I try another Souls-like to see if any dev team has figured out what's so cool and valuable about this genre and what are just mistakes that have turned into tropes. Unfortunately, nobody ever seems to get the whole picture. Anyway though, Lords of the Fallen. This game actually starts off pretty good. To begin with, it feels like it has a decent ratio of legitimate challenge and Souls-like bullshit, and like other games I've spoken about in this video, it has a pretty cool flagship mechanic, that being that the game has 2 versions of the world layered on top of one another all throughout the game. The land of the living, Axiom, and the undead version, Umbral. And you can use this lantern you have to peek into Umbral or cross over altogether. You can also get sent into Umbral if you're killed in Axiom, but if you die in Umbral, you're just dead. So you basically have 2 lives, and you use crossing between worlds to solve environmental puzzles as well. Like if a gate is blocked in Axiom, the way might be clear in Umbral. Point is, the game starts off well and holds that position pretty firmly for maybe a quarter of the way through, but as the ball continues to roll, it unfortunately only rolls downhill. It feels like the developers have no idea which enemies are threatening, and so they end up overpopulating areas with enemies who take entirely too much effort. And this only gets worse as the game progresses, because like other Souls-likes, Lords of the Fallen has no idea how to do late game difficulty. Because when you've spent your whole game trying to be as difficult as possible, obviously when you up the ante, it's more than likely just gonna turn into cheap, unfun nonsense. Even the best Souls-like I ever played, Elden Ring, had that late game problem. But yeah, even though Lords of the Fallen fills areas with too many enemies and uses its stronger enemies too frequently, those are still not their main enemy problem. The main issue for this game is its use of ranged enemies. Of course, keeping in line with the enemy density problem, there are too many ranged enemies, but what's worse is the damage they do is astronomical. Ranged enemies are so imbalanced and mismanaged in this game that it's fucking crazy. And their mishandling of enemy density and distribution in a lot of areas is really unfortunate because most levels are otherwise designed well. The levels branch off and fold back onto themselves in a rewarding way, although sometimes things get a bit confusing with the whole in and out of Umbral thing, but it's mostly a good layout, or it would be if it weren't for the game's enemy placement. Even boss fights are a mixed bag of being kinda good and kinda not. There are good boss fights, but too often does the game lean too hard into a boss gimmick. It kind of feels like Demon Souls in that way, except that game is all gimmick. But Lords of the Fallen bosses sometimes also just have a damage scaling issue, where the damage output is just laughable. And to be honest, that's sort of a problem across the board. Even with very high vitality, there isn't really anything that can't kill you in like 3 hits. It just sucks when bosses like the Spurned Progeny are so well designed artistically, but are such a letdown to fight. Oh, there's also the matter of co-op and the fact that it does function better than what you're used to in these Souls-likes, because you won't just get kicked out of someone's world after you do just about anything, and you don't need weird, idiotic items to party up, so that's a plus. But the scaling and health increase that enemies receive by you being in co-op mode is insane. It's not even normal. There are certain bosses that don't even make sense to fight in co-op because they will be given entirely too much health and or resistances. Listen, here's what I'm getting at with all of this. Fundamentally, as far as Souls-likes go, Lords of the Fallen is competent enough of a game, but if you sum all of its issues into one thing, it's that they have a balancing problem. Maybe the worst balancing problem I've seen in one of these, and that's saying something for this genre. But their core concepts and minute-to-minute gameplay is enjoyable enough that the game doesn't go all the way in the toilet. To me, it's a 6 out of 10 game. And I mean, well, it sold over the 1 million unit benchmark though, so maybe they'll be able to try again in the future. I can't say I'll be playing it. I think I've had enough Souls-likes, honestly. I'll probably not touch another one until Elden Ring 2, and I probably wouldn't play that one, but it'll be too popular not to. All I know is I've played a decent amount of these things, and they're not great. For clarity, I've played Elden Ring, Demon Souls, Neo, Stranger of Paradise, and this. I was gonna try Bloodborne, but I know as soon as I do, they're gonna remaster it for PS5. I just know it. Maybe if they remaster it, I'll play it. I'm not looking forward to that. I'm annoyed already just thinking about it. Anyway, let's move on to the final game of this video, Super Mario Bros. Wonder. And this is a little weird, because why didn't I talk about Super Mario Wonder, right? Mario is a globally known IP. Well, I'll tell you why I kind of skipped mentioning it. Because it's just another Mario game, you know? Not that it isn't good, in fact it's great, but you do know what you're getting. There isn't a ton for me to explain, and it's a 2D side-scrolling Mario. It's not even one of the big 3D ones. But yeah, this is just Nintendo doing what Nintendo does, especially with the Mario IP. They've cornered platformers both 2D and 3D and are virtually unfuckwittable. This game is only further proof of that. Mario Wonder is just wacky, stupid platforming fun. It's a good time, and it's even more fun in co-op. The game has this crown system where the camera will focus on and follow whoever has the crown, but if you die, you lose the crown and it'll go to the next person. So while ultimately everyone's on the same team, there's still this fun, silly, competitive undertone to it. Even if no one's dying though, the crown can still switch based on who reaches the highest point on the flags at the end of each level, and if everyone gets as high as possible, the crown goes to the person who did it first. It really is a good time. The game does a great job of being varied and not spending too long on any one thing. You even have this badge system where you can pick from a bunch of unlockable badges that have different effects. You can only wear one at a time, but you can swap them out freely between levels or if you die. There's a gliding badge, a super jump badge, a badge that gives you a super mushroom at the beginning, all kinds. There's also the wonder flowers that change how certain levels are played for a bit by changing the environment, Mario himself, or both. Sometimes touching a wonder flower turns the level into a top-down maze for a bit. Maybe it just turns off the gravity or fills the top half of the level with water, so if you jump too high, you're suddenly swimming. Or sometimes you get turned into a ball of slime that can stick to walls, or your body gets weirdly elongated and retractable. Just all manner of wacky shenanigans. Plus, Mario Wonder can be tricky and even challenging at times. Some of the levels in the special world are fucking difficult. There's one called Jump to the Beat or something like that, and it's so fucking hard, I kid you not. Listen, to me, as far as I can tell, as much as I've experienced, dedicated platformers cap out at about an 8 out of 10. Personally, I think Super Mario Odyssey and A Hat in Time are two of the best 3D platformers ever, and I'd score both of those an 8 out of 10. Super Mario Bros. Wonder hasn't raised the cap, but it's right there. A great game, an 8 out of 10. And you know what, guys? That's all. We're finally done. That was the last game I wanted to talk about in this video, so if you made it all the way to the end of this, I don't know how, but thanks. If you enjoyed this, why not leave a like, maybe even subscribe, check out some other videos, I don't know, do whatever you want. I hope you have a good time, go check out some games. This is it from me. Until next time, I am Waifu Baldur. I am just a normal guy. I like hentai, and I played too many games this year. Goodbye.